Hello viewers and welcome to another installment of the Lord of the Rings The Card Game Progression Series. My name is Mitch.
And I'm Matthew.
And today, let us evaluate and review the player card contents of the final adventure pack of the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle, Return to Mirkwood. Last time, we unveiled our second expansion hero for tactics, but Matthew, who do we see next for leadership?
The final hero of the cycle is none other than Dane Ironfoot. He has a threat cost of 11, 1 willpower, 2 attack, 3 defense strength, and a whopping 5 hit points. Dane is a dwarf, and while Dane Ironfoot is ready, dwarf characters get +1 attack strength and +1 willpower strength. It's in a way, I was thinking earlier today, almost dreading talking about this hero. Not because it's a bad hero, but rather because it's one of the more maligned heroes in a sense of the game. And what I mean by that is he was cool when he first came out. He potentially teased what the next cycle might be. It ended up being all about the dwarves, which we will catch up to soon in our series. But I don't really know what to say about this hero, which seems so weird. I mean, I think in some ways because he's the most obvious of the heroes. There's no finesse. There's no tricks to be had, really, with Dane. You plop him on the table, and even if you never used him to quest, even if you never used him to attack, even if you never had him defend, it's still a stellar hero. And that's because he boosts every single dwarf on the table. Not dwarves that you control, but if all 4 players are running dwarves, my goodness, they're all getting this boost. And the drawback of being ready is so minor, with unexpected courage or some other tricks we'll see in the future. This guy is almost permanently in a state of being ready, and so dwarves are always getting this boost. And, I mentioned a second ago that he's much maligned now. I think because dwarves were just so powerful for so long, everyone was playing them, and they just got boring to a degree, I think, for some players. And at this point, I don't know anyone who plays dwarf decks except for new players. Not enough has been released, I don't think, in the past year or 2, maybe even 3, to sort of cause anyone to want to revisit sort of the classic Dane dwarf deck. So, I could sit here and talk about every dwarf that gets a boost. It's all of them, and I think that would probably make for a very boring episode. At the time he was released, and really more once we got into Khazad-dûm, and certainly when we got the Hobbit Saga expansions that really mostly focused on dwarves, because there's 13 of them. He was just a staple for a year or 2 in the life of the game, because dwarves are just such powerhouses in the next cycle. So, just a really, really good, plain, straightforward, spam a lot of dwarves on the table and wreck the encounter deck.
Well, Matthew, I have to say I feel a little conflicted about what you're saying, but for the most part, I totally empathize with and understand your sentiments about Dane Ironfoot. And as much as seeing the old fellow brings a tear of nostalgia to my eye, I wholeheartedly agree that Dane ushers in like a whole new level of power to this game. And as I'm about to explain, is just hands down the single most powerful hero released to date, at least in the context of our progression series card pool, and in all possibility, probably the 6 years that LOTR LCG has been released. Even without knowing the card pool like the back of my hand, I'd be willing to bet quite a lot of money that we don't really ever see a hero that even holds a candle to Dane. We've previously talked about the value of heroes and that the sum total of their attribute points normally adds up to their threat cost. And for Dane, he's got 11 stats, he's 11 threat cost, but that ability extends to himself. It not only affects every single dwarf ally and hero controlled by every player, but it also gives him a couple bonus stat points. So, provided you've got some card tricks to enable his ability, ready. That is to ready him. He can quest for 2, he can attack for 3. And you happen to mention that him being ready is a very minor drawback, and I'll say so. I mean, like, look at his stats. 3 defense, 5 hit points. Generally, he's ready until maybe you need him to defend. So even if all of your dwarves aren't necessarily benefiting from his attack boost, they're still able to quest, like, just for absolutely ridiculous amounts. But, you know, Dane is really just, it's an unbridled level of power. He introduces this notion of the dwarf deck, where it's like, if the card is a character, if it's an ally or a hero, and it has the dwarf trait, you may as well put it in a deck. I mean, dwarves benefit from normally being good, and then when Dane adds a couple of stat points to them, it just starts to become absurd. Eventually we see enough heroes that in a 4-player game, all 4 players can start with 3 dwarf heroes. And if that's the case, you're not just getting, 13 stats for his 11 threat cost, but each and every one of those heroes gets +1 willpower, +1 attack. If they can ready, then it just gets all the more ridiculous. So for so many reasons, Dane is just totally unrivaled in regard to his power tier.
Yeah, you touched on the idea that maybe he'll defend, and so you lose the attack boost, which, could be substantial, but in a lot of cases, particularly multiplayer where there's, 2, 3, or 4 players, he might not ever have to defend. So he literally, in many games, just sits there to give the attack strength and willpower strength boost. And in the early life of the game, the first 2 cycles, Shadows of Mirkwood and Khazad-dûm, really almost every quest is about questing and willpower strength and blazing through. And yeah, there's a few boss fights and those sorts of things. Of course, he can help with that too. But just having basically a perma Faramir on the board is frankly ridiculous. And the other reason why I think I have bittersweet feelings about this particular hero and a lot of the early cycle cards is that they've really hampered design space currently. So for example, a card that's similar to Dane is for the Sylvan Dwarves, the hero Celeborn, where the Sylvans enter play and they get a boost similar to the boost that Dane gives, but it's only for the turn they enter play. It's not permanent. And so, we kind of like, well, gosh, I wish Celeborn had this, or gosh, I wish this, Rohan hero had this, or this other person had this, where Dane kind of spoils it for the rest, I guess, is sort of where my feelings are for him. Much like Sword of Gondor has spoiled resource generation for, other cards and other traits, or, honestly, fill in the blank any Shadows of Mirkwood or, Corset card. They, some of the less than careful design has made other cards almost always pale in comparison. So I will never deny the power of this particular hero. It's just one of those things where it's hampered future design space, and it just becomes kind of vanilla and less than exciting, which is probably an interesting comment coming from me, seeing as how I tend to be the tactics smash all that I see kind of player. But to some degree, I prefer slightly more interesting interactions. And so I'm not trying to create some sort of negative impression as into the usefulness or utility of this hero, but rather how he's affected the game more broadly speaking. And then just, how long do you want to play a dwarf deck? Well, I haven't made one in years and don't really see myself doing so anytime soon.
Yeah, I definitely have to agree that Dane isn't necessarily the most exciting hero. I mean, all of those numbers are increased slightly. It's not like there's any interesting interaction. You're just able to smash the encounter deck a little bit harder, right, or quest a little bit more efficiently.
Right.
There's kind of a lot of disparate thoughts I have about Dane that I want to make sure to cover before we move on, though. And just in that he brings in a whole new tier of power. His 3 defense plus 5 HP is a very important threshold where he can survive a hit of 7. And that means if you were to go back and play Journey Along the Anduin, or in the very near future you and I are going to be playing Return to Mirkwood, if you're fighting a hill troll, if it's swings for 6. If it gets an encounter card that, like a shadow card that gives it +1 attack, it can only ever hit for 7 if the attack is defended. So in those scenarios, Dane guarantees that you're not going to lose a hero the first turn, and just for so long the game was, decks were kind of built on this premise of you have to start with lower than 30 threat so that the hill troll will not engage with you right away. You happen to mention that players can just have him sit ready for the entire game, and for that reason he's great for caught in a web or some other condition attachments that we're going to see once we open up the very dwarf-centric first deluxe expansion, Khazad-dûm. But I just really cannot get over how powerful his ability is. I mean, it's just base +1 willpower ever. Like you said, the perpetual blanketing Faramir effect. It's not when dwarves are committed to a quest, it's just always. So they can perform escape tests all the more efficiently. Normally Éowyn is questing for 4, but now Gimli quests for 3, Thalin quests for 2, Glóin quests for 3. Every single dwarf character that we see released from now on, we have to think about, is there going to be Dane in play or is there not? And I've mentioned so many times how I really love efficient cards, like Erebor Hammersmith. All of a sudden, it's 2 cost for 2 willpower and 2 attack. It's still 1 defense, but it's got 3 hit points. You're going to be playing it anyways to bounce Ancient Matham from your discard pile to your hand, so Dane takes already good cards and makes them great. He's just crazy. Use Unexpected Courage, Common Cause, Grim Resolve, whatever it is to make sure that he's ready. And we only get more and more dwarf characters in the very near future, and more dwarf-focused events and attachments. So Citadel Plate, Dwarven Axe. Maybe he's a little bit boring, but I've got to say, winning is not boring, and I certainly look forward to at least a little bit of playing with Dane Ironfoot. But certainly a ridiculous character, and considering that Horn of Gondor was nerfed and Barivor was nerfed, I'm surprised that after so long away from the LOTR community that I come back and Dane is still intact.
I totally agree. And again, I feel like I'm almost being too dour on this particular hero, but I think part of what taints him, and this is my last comment I think towards the card, is again that the Hobbit Sagas came out so soon during the, around the Khazad-dûm time. In other words, the Hobbit Sagas gave us a smorgasbord of dwarf player cards, but also dwarf heroes. Whereas if we had just had Shadows of Mirkwood in the core, plus the Khazad-dûm cycle, there wouldn't have been as many dwarves, and I don't think Dane would have been as powerful. But alas, that's an alternate reality that we didn't experience. And so I think we got a bit more fatigued on him because dwarves, there was just such a glut of their content so quickly, where it wasn't as spread out as a lot of the other trades. But again, a very powerful hero. And I'd be remiss to mention that my moniker on the FFG forums is in fact Dane Ironfoot, but what I'll say is I made that before this card ever came out. I've always had a soft spot for Gimli and dwarves in general. Almost any sort of fantasy setting RPG that I can play, I create a dwarf character. Baldur's Gate series, I've been a dwarf fighter pretty much every time I play that game, and similar sorts of things. And so I wanted a dwarf name for my FFG handle, and I figured Gimli was probably too much on the nose, and I think in fact it was already taken. So I had to scour the interwebs to find another dwarf in Lord of the Rings, because I wasn't super familiar with the text, even though I'd read through the books once. And Dane Ironfoot is the name that came up in my search, and lo and behold, it wasn't taken on the forums, and that is why I will probably forever be known as Dane Ironfoot. But there you go.
And that explains your natural bonus to Constitution as well. But very interesting that I didn't actually warm up to dwarves, I guess, as a race, at risk of that sounding horrible, until Dane had come out, and I developed a respect for them. But before we move on to our leadership cards, I'll just explain the readying trick that I kind of alluded to earlier is after Dane commits to a quest himself, what you can do do is have Unexpected Courage ready him, so he goes from 2 willpower when ready, he drops to 1 when he exhausts to commit to the quest, and then if he's ready when you process the quest resolution step, he's contributing the full 2 willpower. And the same thing goes for when you're resolving him being an attacker. If you've got some clever, tricky way, like Westfold Horsebreaker or anything else, to make sure that he's ready, he attacks the enemy, his attack value drops from 3 to 2, and then prior to determining combat damage, you ready him in between those steps of attack resolution, and then he hits for his full 3. So, absurd character, he only stands to get much, much, much better from here. But that's a whole hell of a lot to say about just one hero. So Matthew, does leadership get any other cards in this adventure pack?
Nope, that's it. Just kidding, let's take a look. The first card is an attachment. It costs 1, and it's another signal, the DoudnaDane signal. It has to attach to hero. The attached hero gains Sentinel. And action, pay 1 resource from attached hero's pool to attach DoudnaDane signal to another hero. Well, Dane is probably a pretty decent candidate for this because, as you mentioned, he defends so well. I prefer the ranged version myself. I'm not sure I've ever used this one to give someone Sentinel. Certainly could be useful if you have a really good defender that isn't Sentinel already. Bilbo can become a fairly decent defender, and he's not Sentinel. But again, like all of these sort of utility cards that either boost stats or grant certain keywords, I think it's pretty good. But perhaps of all of them, this is the one I see played the least.
Yeah, for as much as I had to say about Dane, I don't really have too much to say about the DoudnaDane signal. The cache was not signal trait. This is signal trait. This is cheap if you have a character that doesn't already have Sentinel. If they're a pretty solid defender, it kind of makes sense to affix this to them. So maybe Glowin, maybe Denethor, Gimli. You could adhere this to Boromir for a potentially infinite number of defenses, add DoudnaDane Warning for even better results, and if you're going the Bilbo Baggins route, you may as well drop a Burning Brand into his little hobbit hands as well. I don't think this is very likely to be transferred to another hero. I really think the biggest thing working against this card, if it's not already abundantly clear, you and I are relatively biased in the direction of opting toward chump blockers more than creating one ungodly powerful hero. And DoudnaDane Signal isn't out for so long that eventually we're going to see strong enough built-in Sentinel defenders that this card just strikes me as unfortunately unnecessary. So without a lot of development of the signal trait, this one has a really narrow window of being acceptable to put in decks. But certainly the mileage of other players might vary.
All right, well, the first card for leadership is relatively straightforward. The second one is maybe a bit more nuanced. It is the 2-cost event, Don Take You All. Play after shadow cards have been dealt before any attacks have been resolved. Combat action, each player may choose and discard 1 face-down shadow card from an enemy with which he is engaged. I mentioned on a previous episode that one of the things I like about playing with newer players is that they'll use cards that I haven't seen in forever because their card pool is so small. This is one of them where I've seen it used, and it's always surprised me because I forget that it exists, and it can be helpful, particularly in a 3 or 4 player game. Of course, the gamble that you take is you don't know what shadow effects are being discarded, and maybe there's no effect, but outside of revealing encounter cards during questing, shadow effects are the one thing that can really wreck well-laid plans. So by getting rid of shadow effects, you can more easily plan your defenses. And so I think it's good. I'm not sure it's great in a solo game. I'm not sure, meaning worth the cost. It's maybe more worth the cost in a 2-player game, but I think it's absolutely a great card in a 3 or 4-player game if everyone happened to get swarmed with enemies, say like Massing out Osgiliath, which pretty much swarms everybody. So it is a good card. I'm not sure it's a staple card. But what are your thoughts, Mitch?
Well, this is definitely a very tricky card to talk about because it could be solid gold, or you could pay 2 resources to discard 1 shadow card that does not have a shadow effect. I guess first and foremost, this is one of those sphere bleeding cards where Spirit. Previously, they were kind of the shadow cancellation sphere, but then that was shaken up a little bit when the DoudnaDane Watcher was released, and all of a sudden you can discard an ally to cancel a shadow effect. This is another option that affords leadership players the ability to deal with shadow cards without necessarily running Song of Travel or a Spirit Hero. But it's definitely not guaranteed. For the additional resource, you could do the DoudnaDane Watcher. It could quest, attack, defend, whatever. You could only throw it away when you for sure need to remove 1 shadow effect, but this can affect multiple players. I think kind of the coolest thing about this is that it can remove multiple shadow cards, but generally the way that I play is 1 player kind of draws all the enemies over to their side of the table, and we just do have Spirit to rely on. So I think there are going to be certain scenarios where the encounter deck is so nasty that you absolutely cannot allow a certain shadow effect to resolve, so you use this just as like insurance ahead of time. And there's the occasional shadow effect which can not be canceled. So if you maybe use some sort of scrying and you know for sure that it's coming up, this will allow you to remove a cannot be canceled shadow card. But this is a little bit too uncertain for me to use it very often. And I'm not likely to be using scrying effects like Hinnamarth Riversong in a multiplayer game. I never really use Dark Knowledge, but that can allow you to peek in advance. But I'm just not totally sold on this one. I respect it, but it's just too expensive for too uncertain a prospect.
Yeah, I think I largely agree. Of course, leadership tends to be flush with resources, and 2 is almost nothing. It's just 1 use of Steward of Gondor. It's a sideboard card, I think, for the most part, in that if you know there's a quest with, really nasty shadows that you maybe can't deal with otherwise, maybe you're not using Spirit for whatever reason, and you don't have Hasty Stroke. I like it. It's one I don't use. It's one that I don't typically consider, but frankly, I'd love somebody else to use it, which, if there's in a 4-player game, having sort of a support deck that does all the random niche things, it's always a welcome effect, if not necessarily something I want in my deck.
Yeah. The last thing I can think of to mention is the better you know the contents of an encounter deck, the more acceptable this card might be. Earlier I mentioned the Hill Troll example, and early on in the lifespan of the game, there are going to be instances where I'm sitting there and I say, like, oh, Matthew, it's fine. Defend the Hill Troll with Gimli. There's a 6 out of 50 chance that he'll draw a shadow card that gives him +1 attack, and then the Hill Troll will kill your hero. So you're kind of taking a gamble, and if you know that there's only one thing that could possibly go wrong, if you can remove that possibility for disaster with Dawn Take You All, then it could be worth a little bit of an investment. So it can prevent catastrophe. I don't know if I'm likely to play this anytime soon. Kind of, again, it's another one of those cards where before too long we get some other more alluring alternatives, but I would not think any ill of anyone that might include a few copies of this in their deck.
And that brings us to our tactics cards, and be still, my beating heart, it's another eagle. Eagles of the Misty Mountains, 4 cost, 2 willpower, 2 attack, 2 defense strength, and 4 hit points. It is, of course, a creature and an eagle. Eagles of the Misty Mountains cannot have restricted attachments. Eagles of the Misty Mountains gets +1 attack strength and +1 defense strength for each face-down attachment it has. Response. After another Eagle character leaves play, you may attach that card face down to Eagles of the Misty Mountains. I like this card. It's a little expensive. Tactics is usually, trying to scrounge up all the resources that they can. I wish it would boost its willpower, quite frankly, because Tactics is usually hurting for that. But 2 willpower on an ally in Tactics is pretty decent. But combos very nicely with Vassals of the Windlord and Winged Guardian, which almost always leave play, and so instead of just discarding them, they can go under Eagles of the Misty Mountain to boost them up to 2, 3, 4, 5, who knows what attack or defense strength. In reality, I don't find this guy getting boosted up that often to stellar levels. Again, I usually wish that his willpower was getting boosted up more than I wish that attack or defense was getting boosted up. And frankly, I tend to get Vassals and Windlords on the table long before I could ever get Eagles of the Misty Mountain afforded on the table or drawn. So I really like the card. I like its mechanic, but in reality, it just doesn't go off consistently enough.
Yes, and therein lies the problem, is tactics players, in my experience, are generally strapped for resources, and 4 is a very steep investment. It's 2 attack, 2 defense. Granted, 4 hit points is awesome, but Winged Guardian, 4 defense for 2 resources. Is that not enough? Vassal of the Windlord attacks for 3, which is pretty good, but most importantly, it only costs 1 resource. So I've certainly seen Eagles of the Misty Mountains collect a few discarded eagles underneath it so that it can maybe attack for 5 or 6, but it just seems so much more efficient to use those cheaper eagles. I think the more players that you include in a game, the more likely someone is to use 2 or 3 tactics heroes, and the easier it is for you to hit 4 or more resources, then the more I would suggest a player run a card like this one. But the problem, if I haven't already said enough, is Eagles of the Misty Mountains is expensive, and some of the eagles potentially fueling it are expensive themselves. Descendants of Thorondor costs 4, Landreval costs 5, and all of that is to just give a, +1 attack, +1 defense bonus to this one ally. And when you invest a bunch of resources all into one ally, it's very important to remember that a hero is always going to be, often going to be superior, because allies are prone to card effects like, if defending character is an ally, discard it from play, or return an ally to your hand. Effects like that depending on the scenario can just absolutely ruin all of the time and energy and love and affection that you've poured into these very cool Eagles of the Misty Mountains here. So Radagast can help you a little bit to get this into play faster, but he costs 5. This doesn't have ranged, it doesn't have sentinel, so I think maybe the best case scenario is you do sneaky stuff like Descendants of Thorondor with sneak attack to drop it into play. It damages enemies in the staging area, and then while leaving play, it damages enemies in the staging area, and then instead of going to your hand, you can just put it face down under the Eagles of the Misty Mountains here. So it's a cool card, but it seems like by the time you can get this into play, you've probably got enough going for you that it's a little bit kind of unnecessary and superfluous.
Yeah, the fact that any player's Eagles could support this guy is pretty cool, although in actuality, I don't know if I've ever had that happen. Cool card. I mean, I love the Eagles in general, but I tend to find them a bit underpowered and overcosted or it just they all have cool effects in a way, and they just end up never really working all that well. Certainly not by themselves. They need to be combined with something else. So sadly, it's a trait that I wish was more fleshed out. I wish it was more developed, but it isn't, and this is about all we're going to get for a very long time. And I'm not really sure we're ending on a bang.
Yeah, unfortunately. My final thought is that because some of those eagles are so cheap and so powerful, the Vassal and the Winged Guardian, they go great with stand and fight. And if you're using Eagles of the Misty Mountains to gain attachments, then those cards aren't sitting there in your discard pile to fuel the eagles. And this is going to be the last time I have to say this for quite a long time. The eagles are coming. Allows you to look at the top 5 cards of your deck and add any eagle cards you find to your hand. If you take the number of eagle trait cards in your deck, subtract that by 1, then you take the number of cards in your deck, subtract 1 from that, you divide the former by the latter, multiply your result by 5, and that gives you the average number of cards you're going to draw when you play The Eagles Are Coming. So at this point, we've seen enough eagles that on average, that event is going to draw 1.73 cards for you. But you might not be playing 3 copies of Landreval, 3 copies of this, 3 copies of Descendants. So eagles, this eagle egg, I don't know if it's illegal to eat eagle eggs in Middle-earth, but it just seems like a little bit half-baked. So these guys need to maybe cook a little bit longer before we really keep playing with them. But maybe this is a little bit premature, Matthew. We've got one more tactics cards. Maybe this one's going to end up selling me on the eagles, but what's next?
Well, it is the 3-cost attachment, Support of the Eagles. It is a boon, and it has to attach to a tactics hero. Action, exhaust Support of the Eagles to choose an eagle ally. Until the end of the phase, attached hero adds that ally's attack strength or defense strength, choose one, to its own. Pretty cool card. Certainly if Eagles of the Misty Mountains gets boosted up to, astronomical levels. But again, like anything else, Support of the Eagles is pretty expensive, like all of the Eagle cards. And with Nerf Torn of Gondor, it's going to be even tougher to get these things out. I think it's a great card. It was primarily put on Boromir in the early life of the game because he can ready himself so often. So having great defense strength or attack strength on a hero that could consistently ready was certainly a nice benefit. Even if you just throw the Winged Guardian or Vassal on the table and never use them, but use them to support Boromir or whomever would support the Eagles. Perhaps a decent use of this particular card. Not one I've made a ton of use of, even if I'm making an Eagle deck, but it certainly can be very, very powerful.
Yeah, I just remember way back in the day when we got the teaser article for Return to Mirkwood. At some point, Eagles of the Misty Mountains and Support of the Eagles were spoiled, and my, burgeoning, blossoming LCG player mind was just blown away by how powerful these cards seemed, where, oh my gosh, Eagles of the Misty Mountains, what if it has 6 or 7 attack, and then, Boromir attacks for 10, and then you spend a threat and he attacks another enemy for 10, or he defends for 6. The possibilities are crazy, but when you break it down, Landreval is 5, Descendants of Thorondor is 4, Eagles of the Misty Mountains is 4, this is 3. What I like is that it's not specific to traits, so it's not like Dwarven Axe, it's not like an elf-specific weapon we're going to be seeing in the very near future. You could put this on any tactics hero, whether it's Gondor, Rohan, Hobbit, whatever, and it does persist until the end of the phase, which is cool. It's not unique, so you can put multiple copies on the same character, and it's also worth mentioning that unlike a weapon, unlike Citadel Plate, it's not restricted. You need not even control the eagle that you're targeting, and you could even target an objective eagle ally like Williador, or we end up seeing some of those in the Saga expansions as well. But it's a bummer that you have to draw this after you draw your eagles. After you play your eagles, you need the correct eagle. Like if you're in search of attack value, if you have your winged guardians, that's not really going to do you any good. The other eagles have to remain in play. They can't attack and die or defend and die. And by die, I technically mean be discarded. But, for all I know, the attack bonus could be overkill. It just seems like if you are going to use this card, one little piece of advice is to just make sure that you trigger it and then use your Eagle allies. So if you're going to chump block with your Vassal of the Windlord, use Support of the Eagles while it's still alive to give that attack boost, then do your chump blocking, and then, you maintain that attack bonus. But it's an interesting card. It's great on Legolas. It's great on Bran, Son of Bane. I just think it's one of those cards where it maybe sounds great on paper, but that giant may as well be bright red number 3 for the resource cost just really deters me from playing this attachment.
Well, let's see if our spirit cards strike our fancies a bit more. Up first is an ally. It is the West Road Traveler. She costs 2 willpower strength, 0 attack, 0 defense strength, 1 measly hit point. The West Road Traveler is Rohan and response. After you play West Road Traveler from your hand, switch the active location with any other location in the staging area. I really appreciate the value of this card. I don't know if it was appreciated at its time. Rohan was severely underdeveloped, and I don't know if there were that many locations that had horrible, nasty, travel effects that you just couldn't stomach. With the advent of Nightmare Mode, however, and more current quests, which are just more difficult, generally speaking, she is baller. There are some really nasty travel effects in Nightmare Mode, and some pretty nasty travel effects on Modern Quest, and she is a nice, simple way to get around them, because you are not traveling, you're simply switching. So in those kinds of quests, she is key. As you've mentioned so many times, and as I'm sure we'll mention more and more as we go, you have to know the encounter deck. Lord of the Rings, the card game, is a puzzle in which you take your player cards and the tools you have at your disposal to find a way to beat the encounter deck. And I know that not everyone agrees with that interpretation of the game, or rather, not everyone approaches the game in that way, meaning so many players just want to take the same old tried and true deck and throw it against every quest, and they hate to deck build in this deck building game. Or they don't want to analyze the encounter deck because they feel like that's cheating or something. We get so many comments on our videos. How did you know only 1 out of 33 cards did da-da-da-da-da-da? And that's almost to them akin of cheating. But what I'll say is, cards are solutions to problems the encounter deck is going to throw away, because the designers happen to design both. And so this is one of those cards that, generally speaking, if there are no nasty travel effects on a particular quest, you don't really need her. 2 for 2 willpower is great, but if you're not running Rohan and you're just doing sort of whatever, I think she's one to easily overlook. But if you're playing Nightmare, or you're playing a standard quest that has some nasty travel effects, this card, to me, is an auto-include. And so, I don't know. I approach the game very much like you do, in that I want to know what the encounter deck's going to throw my way. I want to plan for those nasty cards that I need to mitigate, and then know the cards that I can't mitigate, and sort of try to have a plan that way. So I enjoy the puzzle aspect. I enjoy the deck building aspect. And she really is, to me, one of the quintessential cards to figuring out the puzzle that is LOTR LCG.
Yep. Now and then, that ability is going to be fantastically useful. Right off the bat, the stats are great. I've mentioned time and time again, 2 cost for 2 stats that I care about is ideal. So I used to use Eamund as a 3 cost, 2 willpower character. Now I've got a nice, cheaper replacement in the West Road Traveler here. Some really important stuff to keep in mind for that ability is, first off, it's after you play from your hand this ally. So sneak attack does not provide a triggering condition for that response. You have to have an active location in order to switch the active with a location in the staging area. But now and then that ability could be superb. In our tutorial video, you and I, well, I'll take the blame for that one. We forgot that Enchanted Stream was the active location. So if we could have switched the active location, playing her during planning with a different location, we could have Barivore draw us cards during the planning phase, and then maybe we'd be able to get that card that we were digging for that would allow us to push through the next quest phase or beat the scenario or whatever. Something else important to keep in mind for her is that you can avoid travel effects like the Necromancer's Pass, where you manage to work around the travel effect of having to discard cards at random. You can also avoid effects like in the Hills of Emon-Muil. There was a location that was all non-Rohan characters cost an additional 2 matching resources to play. So there's a lot of really cool stuff you can do with this one. Really early on in the core set, there's the Brown Lands and the East Bite combo, where the Brown Lands is a 5 threat, 1 progress token location. The East Bite is 1 threat and 6 progress, but you have to travel there. So if you can switch those two, you're effectively cutting the threat in the staging area by 4. I like that this does stick around, unlike Escort from Aedoros, even though that can quest harder, kind of, a one-off effect, and that Rohan trait does eventually see a little bit of development. So at the moment, I don't think it's worth mustering the Rohirrim just to fetch your West Road Traveler. But, if you're running Aemond or We Do Not Sleep or our next card, then every time you can squeeze even a little bit more value out of some of these characters, then I definitely recommend going for it. So, very cool ally, lots of reasons to revisit it, but for the time being, I think you're going to be seeing it in the Progression series, and long after it's been someday replaced. I certainly think we might come back a time or two and slot it back into decks.
So, up next, a 3-cost event, Astonishing Speed action. Until the end of the phase, all Rohan characters get +2 willpower strength. I've said time and time again that I've been playing a Rohan deck for I don't even know how long, probably a year or two. Too long, because as much as I love to deck build, unfortunately I don't have all the time in the world to do so.
I've noticed.
Yeah. So, oddly enough, not in my Rohan deck. I know that you sort of think it's an affordable and immensely powerful effect, but I don't. I find it expensive, and it's an entire turn's worth of resources. Now, is the effect powerful? Absolutely. I'd rather slap a few escorts from Aedoros on the table, though, for 4 willpower each, than perhaps pay for this, although that, of course, would be a bit more expensive. But Rohan, particularly a little bit later when we get some other heroes like Theoden, the Spirit version, are able to spam allies a bit more easily than this particular event. I sort of view this as a win more card, which I think we've talked about before, but it's one of those things that you really don't play early on because you don't want to just rush from quest stage 1 to 2 necessarily, although you might. But it could be a nice strong finisher, one all-out questing push at the end. But on the flip side, once you're a couple of turns in, you should have a fairly established board state where you don't need every Rohan character to have +2 willpower. So, I don't know, it's one of those cards that never makes the cut because it is expensive. But on the flip side, if it only costs 1 or 2, it's probably overcosted. So, I understand why it costs what it does, but I tend to find other means to get more willpower on the table. But besides thinking it's affordable and immensely powerful, Mitch, what are your other thoughts on this card?
Well, if you're going to spoil my notes
I'm so
to
sorry.
the viewers here, no, this one struck me as interesting. Whenever Matthew and I do these card evaluation videos, I sit down and I think about, the pros and cons of all these cards, and I was kind of puzzled by this one just because it struck me, I've never, ever included this in a deck, but why not? If you really need to blitz through a quest, or you need to beat a quest phase, or smash some specific location, +2 willpower to all Rohan characters is a very powerful effect. Eventually, dwarves are going to get a similar effect where it's kind of a trait-specific blanketing global willpower boost, and I've seen pretty significant success with that, so why not this Rohan version? I maybe was exaggerating a little bit, being hyperbolic when I described this as affordable, just because 3 spirit resources is very significant, and I think it's very uncommon that you and I really find ourselves in a situation where we're about to lose control against the encounter deck, and it really comes down to some all or nothing moment. Certainly, depending on how you build your decks, those times can arise, but for the moment, even though there's a lot of Rohan trait characters, they're just not strong enough that I've got a ton of them sitting in play at any given time. Like Theodred and Éowyn, sure, they're almost always out there, they're almost always on the table doing something. Steward of Gondor tends to find a home on Éowyn, and then hitting 3 resources isn't really a problem, but apart from that, we've got Westroad Traveler, which I'm a big fan of, but Escort from Edoras, which we really only use once, and that's 4 willpower for 2 resources, which is a little bit more affordable. Westfold Horsebreaker I don't really use, Gleowine I use to draw cards, Snowborn Scout by this point is probably long dead, and it's very rare that I actually manage to get out Elfhelm, or the Rittermark's Finest is probably discarded to remove a location from play. I almost never use Dunehir or the Horseback Archer, so I do think that this is probably... I never used to use it just because the available Rohan characters weren't great. They tend to be focused on removing themselves from play, so by the time I've got enough resources that playing this is an option, it's not so necessary or powerful that I wouldn't rather just invest elsewhere. And I think because we're about to see the dwarf trait become extremely powerful, Rohan and Gondor and every other trait for that matter just totally gets overshadowed. And for all those reasons and more, I think this, card just kind of finds a pretty comfortable home in the binder.
Well, the spirit cards didn't embolden us too much, so let's see if lore is any better. Up first is an ally, the Mirkwood Runner. It is a Sylvan Scout ally that costs 3. It has 1 willpower strength, 2 attack strength, 0 defense strength, and 2 hit points. And while Mirkwood Runner is attacking alone, the defending enemy does not count its defense strength. And my goodness, like every other gosh darn lore card, it's so expensive. Its ability is good, but its attack isn't all that great. And so I love that it doesn't count defense. That is fairly phenomenal. But on a big, beefy, boss-like enemy that has a ton of hit points, you're going to be sniping away a ton, where it's probably easier for the tactics player or just to kill it outright, or just have a bunch of allies with Dane and kill it outright. So certainly it offers a lore player outside of the hero Glorfindel from the core set, some decent attack power. He was attacking for 3, although you must count the defense strength. Mirkwood Runner, you don't. I just don't see this one played very often, I think in large measure because of the cost. So ability is great, the cost not so much, and we're going to see an attachment for tactics fairly soon that has a similar ability that's significantly cheaper and much more versatile. So yeah, this one is probably going to sit in the binder for quite a while, at least not for me.
Yeah, this is, it's an unfortunate card. Like so many of these cards we've talked about, it's very cool. I love the theme of this Mirkwood Runner that can just kind of bypass the defense strength of the enemy and totally just assassinate some big nasty. But just like the dwarves are focused on attack strength, we start to see this elf trend of bypassing or ignoring or reducing defense strength. So it's more like finesse versus just hitting something as hard as you can. And there's a lot to like about this character, but it's just kind of frankly not doing enough. Very high defense, very low HP enemies are exceedingly rare. That's not to say that they don't exist, and there's going to be the occasional scenario where the Mirkwood Runner is great, but the fact of the matter is that 2 attack value is almost never enough to kill something. For example, a Hill Troll, I think, has 9 hit points, so do you really want to have a Hill Troll attack like 5 times just so that a lone Mirkwood Runner can end up killing it? And important to keep in mind is that while Mirkwood Runner is attacking alone is the only time that you benefit from that ability, 2 Mirkwood Runners participating in an attack together is not alone, so they hit for 4. They don't bypass defense strength. Ranged characters helping out don't bypass defense. Maybe you could use direct damage like Fallon or a Gondorian Spearman to weaken an enemy for a Mirkwood Runner to deal the killing blow, but increasing the attack strength of non-dwarf allies is exceptionally rare. Outside of stuff like Blade Mastery or for Gondor, you don't really have any options, and if you're running tactics or leadership, do you really need to invest 3 resources in 2 attack strength? So you could use infighting maybe to set up a target to be, assassinatable, if that's a word. But honestly, I can think of another 3-cost card, and it is Forest Snare. And 9 times out of 10, that eliminates an enemy immediately. So Mirkwood Runner is reusable, and it can quest and chump block and blah, blah, blah. But it's just a little bit too ambitious for what the reality of this card is.
All right, well, up next is the 0-cost event, Rumor from the Earth. Action: look at the top card of the encounter deck. Then you may pay 1 lore resource to return Rumor from the Earth to your hand. I don't remember seeing anyone use this. I don't recall if we ever used it in the prior progression series. In general, my playstyle is not lore, and if I play a lore deck, it's not a scrying type encounter deck manipulation deck. Most of my play group doesn't use cards like this either. Again, the manipulating encounter decks, sort of scrying decks. So I guess I like that it's free. Knowing what's coming can be helpful if you have ways to deal with it. Otherwise, you're just sort of screwed. I like that you can put it back in your hand. That's a really neat mechanic that I'd love to see more of. But generally speaking, I don't know. You're going to encounter it anyway. I guess you... And if you don't have any way to deal with it, then it's not going to matter that you looked at it. But I guess in a perfect world, you play this card for free. Your hand is a plethora of options. And so if you know what's coming, it's going to affect your next planning stage, or the way you defend, maybe, to look at a shadow card. So that could be great, but that's perfect world. So this, I don't know. I'm torn, but on the flip side, I don't have enough experience with scrying and encounter deck manipulation to know if this card really in practice is better than I think. My guess is, having played this for years multiplayer and not having ever seen anyone use it, probably signifies that at least a few other people agree that it's just not really worth it. But I don't know, Mitch, defend this card for me.
Well, oh man, this adventure pack so far. Let me see. So, Rumor from the Earth. I guess in the core set, we saw a card called Hinnemarth River Song. It cost 1. It was a unique ally. You play it, and you exhaust it to look at the top card of the encounter deck. So this is strikingly similar. It doesn't cost 1 resource, but you can only ever use it 1 time. As an action, immediately after you play it, you can return it to your hand, but then it costs as much as Hinnemarth does, and the next time you play it, you've got to cough up some cash again, or it's sitting in your discard pile forever. Maybe an event in your hand is a little bit less likely to leave play than is Hinnemarth. Maybe you want to have multiple scrying sources per round, like maybe Hinemarth looks at the first encounter card for staging, Rumor from the Earth looks at the first shadow card as you're about to transition into the combat phase. But I'm unlikely to use scrying when I'm not in a solo player game, and I'm unlikely to include multiple sources of scrying in my deck, and like you said, there's no guarantee that you're going to be able to know, there's no guarantee that you're going to be able to handle whatever you know is coming up next. So ideally, you know how much willpower to commit to the quest, you know whether or not you can have Barivore draw you cards, or instead if you're going to need her to attack or defend or whatever, and that's great. I just think there are better, cheaper options for scrying. So if you're running Denethor, maybe you see the top card of the deck and it's something that's an absolute nightmare, and you're like, okay, I'm going to have to take an undefended attack and have a hero die, but damn it, it's worth it to put that card at the bottom of the encounter deck. It's stuff like that, moments that really allow you to, kind of alter the outcome or trajectory of a scenario that makes scrying worth it. But, if I could just sum up this card, play Hinemarth Riversong, don't play this card. So I like that it's an action, playable during any stage, but that's kind of all that I like about it. So, nothing more to say about that one.
Well, we have one card left. It's a neutral card. It's gotta be good. And it is the 2-cost event, Shadow of the Past. Action. Move the top card of the encounter deck discard pile to the top of the encounter deck. And this is sort of an aside, but I'll talk about this card a bit more directly in a moment. And I was perusing the internet the other day at work because I really didn't want to be working. And one of my co-hosts, well, two of my co-hosts actually, but one in particular has a blog about the game. Ian, his blog is it's Tales from the Cards. Feel free to Google it if you've never read it. It is fantastic, particularly his new player sort of card buying guide. It's great if you're not sure which adventure packs to pick up. But anywho, there was a guest post on his blog recently about this very card, and I actually thought it was pretty compelling and convincing as to the uses of this card that has been universally maligned from the day it was released, with one niche case that, Mitch, I'll let you talk about. So, prior to reading that article just a couple of days ago, I would have said, worthless card, there's one use for it, whatever. But there's actually some really interesting uses for it. So instead of stealing those notes and saying they were all my ideas, I encourage you to check out Ian's blog on this particular article. But what I'll tell you about the history of the card is just what I said. It's pretty much universally panned. It's almost like they only made it with one sort of situation in mind. It's a sideboard card if there ever was one. This is not a card you're going to include in every single deck, but you can do some kind of cool stuff with it. So, Mitch, I'll let you explain the cool stuff.
Well, I will say I very much enjoyed that article in question, so huge props to the Wandering Took, was the guest author for that article, and it actually inspired me to add a bullet point to my list of reasons to play this card, so kudos to that gentleman. But Shadow of the Past is definitely a card when it came out, I looked at it and I thought, well, this is one of those real puzzlers where you really have to kind of scrape the bottom of the barrel of ideas to, justify including it in a deck. It doesn't really seem like it does much, but it can go into any deck. It's not hugely expensive, although 2 is not insignificant, but it can do some pretty clever stuff. So you're taking the top card of the encounter discard pile, and you're putting it on the top of the encounter deck. So in that sense, it counts as some basic scrying. You know the specific card that is coming up next, and it can be used during any phase. So you could say, okay, for staging, I know the card that I'm going to get if I'm a single player, or I know one of the X cards if it's a multiplayer game. And that in and of itself has a lot of uses. So you can take, ideally, an encounter card that is totally ineffectual and put it back on the top of the encounter deck. So Evil Storm, if you don't have 35 threat, if no player has 35 threat, the when revealed effect does nothing. It doesn't surge, it resolves and does nothing, and you're done. In that sense, this is like a 2-cost neutral version of the 3-cost Lore Gildor's Council. You can also return weak encounter cards to the top of the encounter deck, like Enchanted Stream. When you have Northern Tracker in play, a 2-threat, 2-progress token location gets steamrolled pretty quickly by a tracker. On occasion, and this is one of those very scenario-specific cards, you'll have a genuinely beneficial card that you can put back on top of the encounter deck. Forest Grove comes to mind from A Journey to Rosgobel, where you can dig for Athelas again. Old Forest Road in Passage Through Mirkwood, if you're really struggling to overcome that quest, maybe you put another location into play that when you travel to it, you can ready one of your heroes. Certain scenarios like the Dead Marshes will have cards that you want at the top of your deck just for convenience's sake. Matthew and I got lucky, and Gollum did not escape into the encounter deck, but if we'd have failed enough escape tests, if he would have escaped from us, he would have been maybe discarded as a shadow card, we could have put him back on top of the encounter deck so that we didn't have to play the game for another hour. And the same thing could be said for Athelas as well. You could set up a blank or weak shadow card, just like you might use Dawn Take You All to ensure that catastrophe isn't going to occur. Shadow of the Past can function that exact same way. And you can even combine this with scrying, like Rumor from the Earth or Hinnamarth River Song, so that you can make it so that in a multiplayer situation you can scry the top several cards. So you play one or more copies of Shadow of the Past after looking at the top card of the encounter deck, and then you kind of know the reverse order. So you could say, like, okay, it's going to be the Necromancer's Reach, and then on top of that I put a copy of something else. Or if you know that a card is going to surge, maybe you know what it's going to surge to. And then the last thing I have to mention is that in certain scenarios, you can even kind of cheese the encounter deck. We eventually see a scenario, well, a deluxe expansion called Heirs of Numenor with some very difficult scenarios, and this card kind of made a bit of a resurgence because if you can kind of maximize the number of times that the encounter deck essentially whiffs, you can really neuter a scenario. So for the moment, if Matthew and I are always questing with Thalin, for Dane, Thalin now quests for 2. He deals a point of damage to enemies while they're revealed from the encounter deck. Eastern Crows dies before they surge. In Return to Mirkwood, Mirkwood Bats dies before it surges. And if you can make sure that that happens not just once during a given scenario, but 2, 3, 4, or more times, then you can really kind of, lessen the impact that the encounter deck can have. So by no means would I suggest that Shadow of the Past is like an auto-include card for any deck, but on occasion, it's going to be pretty damn good. I know that whenever Matthew and I progress to the Redhorn Gate to improve our quality of life, we're definitely going to be including this in decks just to make sure that some certain victory point possessing locations don't escape into the encounter discard pile. But, this is an interesting card. Definitely one that I underestimated at first, one that I respect now, but that article did a great job of kind of indicating some reasons why we should think very critically about cards that the community once saw as total duds. I've certainly warmed up to this myself now that I'm taking a second look after a few years of separation, but I don't know that I'm exactly scrabbling or clamoring to include this card in my decks. But anything else, Matthew, to say about our neutral card, or shall we wrap up the episode?
Let's wrap it up.
All right. So, as always, thank you to everyone for making it this far. Thus concludes Return to Mirkwood. We saw Dane Ironfoot and a smattering of some rather lackluster cards, but Matthew, dare I ask your overall impressions of our Ultimate Adventure Pack?
Well, one of the best heroes in the game, certainly. Well, maybe not when he was released, but as soon as the Hobbit Sagas are out in Khazad-dûm, Dwarf Cycle, certainly one of the best heroes in the game. But outside of him, I think the only cards worth even mentioning are Support of the Eagles and West Road Traveler. Everything else is, to me, sort of dead on arrival. So, this cycle goes out on a whimper, at least as far as the player cards are concerned, and the hero's power is very quickly to be revealed. But even when he's revealed, I'm not sure he's the best thing ever. So, it is what it is, but I am looking forward to playing this quest because it's not one I've played a ton. So hopefully that will be a little bit more fun and interesting than the cards we just talked about.
Most definitely. I've got to say, I gave these cards a solid try when they came out, but I feel like I've given them all the attention that they deserve, and unfortunately, a great many of these are going to be kind of lost to the ages. We kind of, fetched them out of the bin for the progression series, and now we can kind of put them back in the trash, or the binder, or perhaps your bicycle spokes, depending on who you are. But yeah, I like the West Road Traveler. Support of the Eagles is great with Vassal of the Windlord, Winged Guardian. Unfortunately, I've pretty much got to stop talking right there. Shadow of the Past, on occasion, is going to be revisited. But like I said before, sometimes it's more of a quality of life choice as opposed to like we really need this to just break this scenario. Because, what happens if Mirkwood Bats is sitting at the top of your discard pile, and you don't have Shadow of the Past to return it to the top of the encounter deck. And because I forgot to mention it earlier, one of the coolest things about Shadow of the Past is, when you and I play, we normally aren't engaged with a ton of enemies, and the enemies that we are engaged with, normally we destroy in pretty short order. We're reasonably efficient players like that. Mm-hmm. But if for some reason you have to discard a bunch of shadow cards in mass at the end of the combat phase, you pick which of those goes on top. So you can kind of engineer the encounter deck to be most advantageous if you're trying to get Shadow of the Past to function. But that's not an auto-include by any means. So is this pack worth picking up just for Dane Ironfoot? As a dwarf fanboy to the core, I of course say yes. But if he's not quite your fancy, unless you're really into the Eagle decks or maybe the West Road Traveler, this one's kind of skippable. Hopefully the scenario will be a little bit more fun, but I suppose we'll have to see, because next time we're going to wrap up our Shadows of Mirkwood cycle. Hopefully we'll one-shot our return to Mirkwood, but unless Gollum manages to elude us, I've had a lot of good memories looking back on all these old cards, even if some of these are a little bit lackluster. But, Matthew, we've come to the close of yet another installment of the Progression series. Plug your podcast, and let's get out of here.
Well, I would love it if you would join my co-host and I on our latest episodes of the Grey Company podcast, where we take an in-depth look at the Lord of the Rings LCG, in particular focusing on strategy, deck building, and the metagame. You can find us on iTunes, Facebook, and Twitter. We are the Grey Company podcast.
It definitely comes highly recommended. I've been re-listening to their series myself. So definitely check out The Grey Company. If you want to get in touch with me on Twitter or on Facebook, I'm the Hive Tyrant. I'm on Board Game Geek, Card Game DB, the FFG forums as well. If at any point you have even the barest modicum of inclination to contribute a small monetary donation to the ongoing Progression series, I'm on Patreon as well. But as always, thank you so much for watching, and check back in again soon for much more Lord of the Rings the card game content to come, and take care.